In the summer of 911, a turning point for Western Europe wasn't decided in the Frankish council halls, but on the battle line beneath the ancient stone walls of Chartres. There, Viking warriors, proud yet driven to the brink by hunger, fixed their eyes on the city as their last chance to survive. Facing them was a town with no standing army in sight, armed instead with unshakable faith and an age-old relic. The Siege of Chartres produced scenes that seem almost impossible to square with conventional warfare, from a steel shield wall breaking under spiritual force to the haunting wall of flesh on the hill at Lair. And it didn't end in annihilation, but in a historical paradox. The side that emerged on top chose compromise at the negotiating table, unintentionally laying the first stone of Norman power, a force that would conquer England more than a century later. But before we unravel this impossible tale, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, help us out by hitting that like button and subscribing. And please, tell me where you are listening from today. It creates a powerful sense of connection to know that we are exploring these ancient struggles together. To see why the Vikings ended up starving outside Chartres, we need to rewind the clock and trace the chain of events that led to this siege. For decades, the Seine River had been a highway for the Northmen. It was their private road into the heart of the Frankish Empire, a vein they could tap whenever they needed silver, captives, or food. But by the early 10th century, something fundamental had changed. The vein had run dry. If you stood on the banks of the Seine in those days, you wouldn't see the rich, golden fields that once made this region the breadbasket of the West. You would see a wasteland. The fields were choked with shrubs and wild trees because the plough had not touched the soil in years. The local people had either fled to fortified towns or been carried off in chains. This created a terrifying logistical problem for Rollo, the leader of the Vikings. We often think of Vikings as men driven only by a lust for gold or a love of battle. They were those things, certainly, but more than anything, they are a machine that runs on calories. Rollo led what the old writers called a great army. This was a massive collection of warriors who had gathered under his banner. These men needed grain, cattle, and wine every single day just to function. But the region around the Seine was exhausted. There was no wine left in the cellars and no livestock left in the fields. To understand why Rollo didn't just pack up and go home, we have to look at the ruthless mechanism that brought him here in the first place. Rollo didn't leave his home in the north for the sake of adventure. He was pushed out. At the time, historians described the northern lands, what they called Dacia, or Scandinavia, as a hive that was bursting with too many people. When the population grew too high, the fathers would turn against their own sons. To make sure there was enough food for those who stayed, the older generation would cast lots. They would strip the younger men of their inheritance and banish them by force. It was a system of survival by expulsion. These exiled youths were not colonists sent out with a blessing. They were outcasts. They were driven away from their own shores to fight for someone else's land because they had no legal right to their own. They were sent to live like wolves so the sheep at home could graze in peace. Rollo was the product of this unforgiving world. He was the son of a powerful leader, but when his father died, a neighbouring king seized the moment to crush the family. Rollo was forced to flee. He spent years wandering the coasts of Europe as a man without a country. He had gone to England to fight as a mercenary. He had raided the coast of Frisia, the low-lying marshlands of the modern-day Netherlands, to squeeze the local dukes for tribute. But a roving army cannot survive on salt water and promises forever. They need land. They need a place to eventually turn their swords into ploughs. By the time Rollo returned to the Seine, the pressure was at a breaking point. The river valley was empty. The easy targets were gone. The Northmen were sitting in a desert of their own making and their supplies were dwindling. This depletion forced a change in strategy. They could no longer rely on the hit-and-run tactics of the river raids. They couldn't stay on their ships because the river banks offered nothing to eat. To survive, they had to leave the safety of the water. They had to go inland. Rollo needed a target that hadn't yet been bled dry. He needed a city that still had full granaries and locked cellars. He needed Chartres. So, the Vikings turned their backs on the Seine. They began the march toward the rich, untouched interior of France. They moved with the confidence of men who had never been defeated in an open field. They had crushed peasants, humbled dukes, and terrified kings. They believed that no force in this land could stand against them. The citizens of Chartres likely heard them coming days before they arrived. The smoke, the dust, the refugees running ahead of the column. Rollo was bringing the great army to their doorstep. But as the Vikings encircled the city expecting an easy meal, they found something they hadn't calculated. They ran into a wall of spiritual defiance, and behind those walls, one man was about to make a phone call that would change everything. The phone call that saved the city of Chartres wasn't made with a wire or a satellite. It was made with ink, parchment, and a very fast horse. But before we look at the message, we have to look at the situation inside the city. It was terrifying. You have to imagine the noise, the rhythmic thud of Viking axes testing the heavy oak gates, and the smell of smoke rising from the burning houses just outside the walls. Thousands of refugees were packed into the narrow streets. They had barely made it inside before the iron-studded doors slammed shut. Standing in the middle of this panic was Bishop Waldhelm. In most history books, bishops are painted as quiet men in robes who pray while the soldiers do the fighting. But in the 10th century, a bishop was often the only real government a city had. The king of the Franks, Charles the Simple, was hundreds of miles away. He was paralysed by politics. Waldhelm knew that if he waited for the king to save them, Chartres would be a pile of ash before the first royal soldier arrived. So, Waldhelm had to become a general. He didn't have an army, but he had something just as powerful: a network. We tend to think of the medieval church as purely religious, but you should view it as the internet of the Dark Ages. It was the only institution that crossed every border. It had Latin, a universal language that allowed a priest in one city to talk to a leader in another region without a translator. Most importantly, it had authority. If a king asked you to fight, you might say no. If a bishop told you that God demanded you fight to save a sacred object, you said yes. Waldhelm knew he couldn't fight the Vikings man for man. These Northmen were professional killers. They were currently starving and desperate, and they were digging in for a long siege to wait the city out. So, Waldhelm went to his writing desk. He drafted urgent letters. He didn't send them to the king. He sent them to the local warlords who actually held the power in the Frankish realm. He wrote to Richard, the Duke of Burgundy. Richard was a hard man and a veteran commander who led a force of heavy cavalry, soldiers who fought on large, powerful horses. He also wrote to Eberlus, the leader of the Frankish forces from the west. Eberlus was a different character entirely, proud, arrogant, and hungry for glory. The message was simple. Waldhelm didn't just ask for military aid. He created a spiritual emergency. He told them that the pagans were at the gates of the Virgin Mary. Chartres held a sacred relic called the Sancta Camisia. This was the tunic believed to have been worn by Mary when she gave birth to Jesus. Waldhelm argued that letting the Vikings take this cloth was a sin that no amount of prayer could ever wash away. This was the lever. Waldhelm turned a military problem into a religious crisis. Messengers slipped out of the city at night, dodging the Viking scouts. They rode hard to the south and the east. While Waldhelm waited, the siege ground on. The Vikings were stripping the surrounding land bare, cutting off the city's food and waiting for hunger to do the work for them. The response was faster than anyone expected. Richard of Burgundy mobilized his heavy horsemen. Eberlus of Poitou gathered his knights. These weren't small raiding parties. These were massive relief armies. They began to march toward Chartres, driven by the bishop's panic and the promise of divine favour. Suddenly the map of the war flipped. A few days ago, Rollo was the predator and Chartres was the prey. But as the dust clouds from the approaching Frankish columns appeared on the horizon, Rollo entered a tactical nightmare. He was besieging a city, but now he was about to be surrounded himself. This created a hammer and anvil scenario. The city walls were the anvil. The approaching Frankish lords were the hammer. Rollo's Vikings were the metal caught in between. The Northmen suddenly had to look over their shoulders. The silence of the countryside was broken by the sharp sound of Frankish trumpets. Rollo had to make a choice. If he stayed focused on the city, the relief army would smash into his back. If he turned to fight the relief army, the soldiers inside Chartres might rush out and hit him from behind. Most commanders would have retreated back to their boats, but the Vikings were hungry, and they had nowhere else to go. Rollo didn't run. He turned his men around and prepared to receive the charge. On the flat plains outside Chartres, The heavy cavalry of Burgundy was lining up against the infantry of the north. Steel was about to meet flesh. The Duke of Burgundy didn't march to Chartres to negotiate. He came to break things. As his long line of heavy horsemen thundered across the plain, his plan was simple. It was the same strategy the Franks had used for a century: find the enemy, point the lances, and charge. In the 10th century, a heavy cavalry charge was the most powerful weapon on the battlefield. These were professional soldiers on massive horses, covered in iron and moving at high speed. It was a wall of muscle and metal designed to shatter an enemy's line in a single impact. The Duke looked at the Vikings surrounding the city and expected them to scatter. He thought they would run for the river or break their formation in a panic. But on the other side of the field, Rollo was watching. He knew his men couldn't outrun horses on a flat plain. He also knew they couldn't win a scattered brawl against a man on a 2,000-pound animal. So, he turned to a tactic that was already ancient but perfect for his foot soldiers. He ordered his men to form a shield wall. Imagine a tortoise shell made of wood and leather. The Vikings stood shoulder to shoulder, overlapping their large long shields until they formed a solid, continuous barrier. They didn't just hold these shields. They braced them with their shoulders and feet, locking their bodies together into one single, heavy mass. This changed the physics of the entire battle. A horse is a smart animal with a strong survival instinct. It will charge at a man who is running away, but it will almost never charge directly into what looks like a solid, unmoving wall. It will shy away or stop. When the Frankish cavalry hit Rollo's line, they didn't crash through it. They crashed against it. The momentum of the charge died instantly. The battle stopped being a fast-moving attack and turned into a meat grinder. The Franks were stuck on their horses, trapped in a crowd, stabbing downward with lances. The Vikings were on the ground, protected by their shields, stabbing upward into the soft bellies of the horses and the legs of the riders. These Vikings weren't mindless warriors. They were disciplined professionals. They absorbed the massive shock of the heavy cavalry, held their ground, and then began to push back. The fighting was brutal and very close. This was a clash of iron where individual skill mattered much less than sheer endurance. The battlefield filled with the deafening noise of metal hitting wood and the screaming of injured horses. A thick cloud of dust rose into the air, making it hard to see or even breathe. Hour after hour the deadlock held. The Franks couldn't break the shield wall and the Vikings couldn't break out of the circle. The ground became slick with blood, making it even harder for the horses to find their footing. The Duke had hammered the anvil, but the metal in the middle refused to bend. The military solution had failed. The best soldiers in the Frankish realm had thrown everything they had at the Northmen, and the Northmen were still standing. Both sides were exhausted. The sun was high, the casualties were mounting, and the situation was frozen. Steel had done all it could do. If you were a betting man in the 10th century, you would have put your money on the Vikings. They were harder, more desperate, and they had nowhere else to go. They were used to winning wars of endurance. But inside the walls of Chartres, Bishop Waldhelm decided to change the weapon entirely. He didn't reach for a sword. He went deep into the cathedral vault, opened a sacred box, and took out a piece of ancient cloth. To our modern minds, a piece of old clothing is just a museum artifact. But in the year 911, people believed in relics, physical objects that had been touched by the divine. These weren't just symbols. They were seen as sources of holy power. The people of Chartres believed they possessed the Sancta Camisia. To the people inside the city, it was a contract. It meant the Queen of Heaven had a personal, physical stake in whether their city survived. While the Frankish knights were gasping for breath on the field, the city gates creaked open. The Vikings were likely expecting a sudden rush of soldiers. Instead, they saw a procession. Bishop Waldhelm walked out first. He was wearing his full ceremonial gear, including his tall, pointed hat. He held a cross in one hand and the sacred tunic in the other. Behind him were the choir, the clergy, and the citizens of Chartres. They weren't screaming war cries. They were singing hymns. The Vikings were pagans, but they weren't atheists. They lived in a world they believed was thick with spirits, gods, and monsters. They respected power. They had just fought Frankish iron for hours and survived. But seeing this wall of unarmed people walking toward them, chanting in a strange language and holding up a mysterious white cloth, did something to their minds. It spooked them. The sight felt like a physical blow. It was the sudden, terrifying certainty that they were fighting something they couldn't hit with an axe. The morale of the Viking army suddenly snapped. Panic is a contagion. It starts with one man dropping his shield and spreads until it consumes the whole line. The Vikings broke their formation. They turned their backs on the city walls and began to run. Rollo watched his legendary discipline evaporate in an instant. He couldn't rally his men against a ghost. The retreat was total chaos. The Vikings pulled back from the city, abandoning their siege lines and their supplies. They ran toward a nearby hill called Lair, looking for high ground where they could regroup. This movement changed the entire layout of the war. An hour ago, Rollo had the city surrounded. Now, he was the one huddled on a hilltop. He had gathered his men into a tight defensive ball, but he had made a fatal mistake. By retreating to the hill, he allowed the Frankish armies to surround him. The Vikings were alive, but they were cut off. They were miles from their ships and separated from their food. As the sun began to set, they looked down from the hill and saw the Frankish forces circling the base, locking them in. The exhausted soldiers of the Franks were now leaning on their spears, catching their breath. They had survived the Viking storm. They had seen the miracle of the tunic. They had won. But while the victors rested, the sound of fresh trumpets echoed from the road. A new column of knights rode onto the battlefield. Their armour was clean, and their horses were fresh. This was Count Eberlus of Poitou, and he was furious. In the medieval world, war wasn't just about winning, it was about reputation. To miss a battle was a political disaster. Eberlus had marched hundreds of miles to save Chartres, only to arrive just as the fighting stopped. He felt cheated of his fame. He immediately began cursing the other commanders. He shouted that they had ignored him by starting the fight without his help. He told them he would rather have died in the battle than missed his chance to be a hero. The Duke of Burgundy was beyond tired. He was covered in dust, sweat, and blood. He looked at this fresh, arrogant count and pointed a finger toward the nearby hill where the Vikings were trapped. He told Eberlus that if he was so hungry for a fight, the enemy was right there on the hill and he was welcome to go and finish them off. A careful commander would have looked at that hill and waited. The Vikings were surrounded. They had no water and no food. If the Franks simply waited until morning, the Northmen would have to surrender or starve. But Eberlus didn't want to surrender. He wanted a story for the history books. He ordered his men to attack the hill immediately. It was a massive mistake driven by ego. Attacking uphill against heavy infantry is one of the hardest moves in warfare. You lose your momentum, your horses tire out, and the enemy has gravity on their side. Rollo saw them coming. His men were battered, but they were veterans. As the knights scrambled up the slope, the Vikings rained down darts and heavy stones. Then something embarrassing happened. Eberlus's men had brought portable wooden fences. These are screens meant to protect them from arrows as they advanced. But in the middle of the fight, the Vikings reached out, snatched these barriers away from the Frankish attackers, and set them up for their own defence. Rollo was now using the attackers' own equipment to keep them out. The attack stalled. Eberlus tried to force his way through the ring of shields and stolen fences, but the Northmen wouldn't budge. They fought with the ferocity of men who knew that being captured meant a quick execution. As the light faded, Eberlus realised he had made a mistake. He couldn't break them. He sounded the retreat and rode back down the hill to join the rest of the Frankish army. The situation had now shifted to a siege of containment, where you trap an enemy in one spot and wait. The Frankish forces settled in for the night. They surrounded the hill on all sides. They lit hundreds of campfires and prepared to wait for the dawn. From the Frankish perspective, the situation was perfect. Rollo was trapped in a cage. He couldn't get back to his ships and he couldn't break out through the ring of cavalry. Tonight, the Franks would sleep. Tomorrow, they would kill him. But up on the dark hilltop, the mood was very different. The Vikings were shivering, wounded, and desperate. Rollo knew his shield wall wouldn't hold for another day. He needed a defence that was stronger than wood and iron. In the pitch blackness of the night, he gave a terrifying order that turned the hill into a slaughterhouse. The night over the hill was heavy and dark. Down on the plain, the Frankish campfires were burning bright. You can imagine the sounds of a winning army, the clinking of wine cups and the laughter of men who believed the war was already over. But up on the hill, Rollo wasn't planning to give up. He was looking at his own supply train, the herds of cattle, the donkeys, and the horses that had carried his men this far. To a medieval army, livestock was everything. These animals were your food, your transport, and your wealth. To kill your own animals was a form of suicide. It meant that even if you survived the battle, you would be left stranded and penniless. But Rollo had no stone to build a wall. He had no timber to build a fence. He only had muscle and bone. So in the dark he gave an order that must have felt like madness. The Vikings slaughtered their horses, their oxen, and their donkeys. They stripped the bloody hides and piled the bodies one on top of another. They stacked them like heavy bricks, layer by layer, until they had built a wall made entirely of raw meat. It sounds desperate, but there was a cold logic to it. Rollo was facing heavy cavalry. A Frankish warhorse is a highly trained animal, but it has a deep, natural fear of the smell of fresh blood and death. Rollo was betting that the Frankish horses would refuse to charge into a wall of bloody carcasses. He was building a barrier that didn't just stop a sword, it assaulted the senses. As the sun rose, the Frankish lords and their knights rode out to finish the job. They looked up at the hill, expecting to see the tired faces of the Northmen. Instead, they saw a fortress of flesh. The effect was instant. The sight terrified the horses and sickened the men. The stench of thousands of slaughtered animals baking in the morning sun drifted down the hill. Thousands of flies began to buzz in the heat. It was a nightmare of dripping limbs and open hides. The Frankish knights lived by a strict code of honour. They believed war should be a clean, noble struggle. This sight was beyond anything they could handle. They stopped in their tracks. It wasn't just fear of Viking axes, it was pure revulsion. The Franks refused to climb that hill. They refused to wade through a river of blood to get to the enemy. This disgust changed the entire nature of the siege. The tight noose around the Vikings loosened. The Franks pulled their lines back, assuming that men crazy enough to wall themselves in with dead animals were going to stay put. The commanders ordered their men back to their tents. They posted a few guards, but the alertness was gone. They didn't want to look at the hill, so they turned their backs. Rollo had turned his greatest weakness into a psychological weapon. He had disgusted his enemy into doing nothing, but a wall of flesh has a time limit. It rots. Rollo knew he couldn't stay there forever. He had bought one more day of life, but he was still surrounded. To survive the night, he would have to pull off one final impossible trick. Among Rollo's men was an advisor who understood the Frankish mind better than the Vikings did. He knew the Franks were tired. He knew they were superstitious. And most importantly, he knew they were terrified of the Viking reputation. He proposed a plan that didn't require axes or arrows. It required noise. The advisor told Rollo to use the darkness. The Franks believed they had the Vikings contained on the hill. They assumed the Northmen were cowering behind their wall of dead horses waiting for the end. They weren't expecting an attack. So, in the middle of the night, a small elite group of Vikings slipped over the rampart. They didn't carry shields. They carried war horns. They crawled through the tall grass, inching their way around the edges of the sleeping Frankish camp. They positioned themselves behind the enemy lines in the woods and the shadows. Then, at a prearranged signal, they blew. The sound tore through the silence of the night. It came from the darkness behind the Frankish camp. To a sleeping soldier waking up in a panic, it didn't sound like a few men with horns. It sounded like a massive relief army had arrived. Panic is faster than thought. A cry went up in the camp. "Rollo is here!" The Franks believed that a fresh Viking fleet must have arrived on the river. They thought they were being surrounded. The discipline of the besieging army collapsed instantly. Men didn't grab their armour. They grabbed their horses and ran. The camp dissolved into chaos. This was the moment Rollo was waiting for. Up on the hill, the main body of the Viking army were ready. As the confusion spread below, Rollo ordered the charge. They poured down the slopes of the hill. They didn't look like a starving, trapped army. They looked like a pack of wolves let off a leash. They smashed into the disorganized Frankish lines, cutting a path through the confusion. They weren't trying to win the battle anymore. They were breaking the cage. Rollo and his men fought their way through the panic, slipping through the gaps in the enemy lines. They marched hard and fast, putting distance between themselves and the city. They reached a defensive position near the river, a place surrounded by marshland where the heavy Frankish cavalry couldn't follow. By the time the sun rose, the hill was empty. The wall of carcasses was just a pile of rotting meat. The Vikings were gone. The Siege of Chartres was technically a Frankish victory. They had saved the city. But strategically, it was a failure. They had the Viking leader trapped, and yet he had slipped through their fingers. Rollo was still alive. His army was battered, but it was intact, and now he was angry. The Vikings began to burn the countryside with a new ferocity. They weren't just looking for food now, they were looking for revenge. They ravaged the lands of the king and his nobles, proving a terrifying point. You cannot kill us. You can beat us in a battle, but you cannot exterminate us. King Charles the Simple looked at his burning kingdom and realized the hard truth. The military solution had failed. The king's reputation was dissolving in the heat of the fires. This forced a change in strategy. It was time to stop fighting and start talking. History has been unkind to Charles. His nickname, the Simple, originally meant straightforward, but it eventually came to mean foolish. But in this moment, Charles was about to make one of the smartest decisions in the history of the Frankish realm. His nobles came to him with a blunt message. They told him the land was a desert. They told him to protect the realm by making peace. In other words, stop trying to kill them. It isn't working. Buy them off. The king's advisors proposed a radical idea. They didn't just want to pay Rollo to go away. The Franks had tried that before, and the Vikings always came back. They wanted to pay Rollo to stay. The logic was cold and brilliant. The Vikings were excellent killers. They controlled the mouth of the Seine River, the highway to Paris. If the king couldn't kick them out, perhaps he could hire them. If he gave Rollo the land legally, Rollo would have something to lose. He would stop being a raider and start being a landlord, and more importantly, he would become a shield. If other Viking pirates tried to sail up the river to attack Paris, they wouldn't run into a weak local lord. They would run into Rollo. It is the classic strategy of setting a thief to catch a thief. King Charles listened. He realized that to save the kingdom, he had to carve off a piece of it. He accepted the advice. But how do you offer a job to a man who is currently burning your villages? You need a diplomat. King Charles sent for an archbishop named Franco. Franco was a man who walked between worlds. He was a high-ranking churchman, but he had lived in a city under Viking occupation. He knew Rollo. He knew the Northmen respected strength and land. Franco rode out to Rollo's camp. The message he carried was a mix of a bribe and a threat. He essentially told Rollo, "You are the greatest warrior of your age, but you're going to die eventually. Do you want to die a pirate, fighting every day for your next meal? Or do you want to die a duke, with land that belongs to your children forever?" The king offered a massive package. He offered the fertile land along the coast. He offered a formal place in the Frankish government, and to seal the alliance, he offered his own daughter, Gisla, in marriage. Rollo listened. He consulted his captains. They looked at the empty fields of the Frankish kingdom and the strength of their own tired army. They realized the raiding lifestyle had hit a dead end. They couldn't conquer all of the Frankish lands, but they could own a piece of it. The Northmen agreed to the terms. They called for a truce to set up a formal meeting. This was a massive shift in the world. For 100 years, the relationship between the Vikings and the Franks had been predator and prey. Now it was shifting to lord and vassal, a relationship of loyalty and land. The Franks were admitting they couldn't defend their own coast, so they were outsourcing the job to the invaders. The fighting stopped. The smoke cleared. But the hard part wasn't over. A verbal agreement is one thing, a public ceremony is another. King Charles and Rollo agreed to meet at a specific place on the border, a spot called Saint-Clair-sur-Epte. It was supposed to be a dignified transfer of power, but putting a Viking warlord and a Frankish king in the same room was a recipe for culture shock. Charles expected a humble servant. Rollo expected a business partner. As the two armies gathered on opposite sides of the river, nobody realized that the ceremony was about to turn into a famous comedy of errors. The meeting took place on the banks of the river Epte. It was a small river, but in the autumn of 911, it was the most important line on the map. On one side stood the Frankish army, glittering in their armour. On the other side stood the Northmen, unwashed, battered, and suspicious. The air was thick with mutual distrust. Neither side wanted to cross the water. The Franks were terrified of the Viking axes. The Vikings were terrified of a Frankish trap. The two armies settled down on opposite banks and stared at each other across the water. It was a diplomatic standoff. To break the deadlock, they used a go-between. The Archbishop crossed back and forth, carrying messages through the mud. King Charles started with a low offer. He proposed that Rollo take the land of Flanders in modern-day Belgium. Today it is rich and famous. But in the 10th century, it was a mess of marshes and bogs. It was hard to farm and even harder to defend. Rollo rejected it immediately. He told the Archbishop that he would not accept marshy lands. He wasn't looking for a place to catch frogs. He was looking for a kingdom. He wanted the rich soil he had spent the last 20 years burning. He wanted the fertile coast of what we now call Normandy. The king had no leverage left. His kingdom was burning. So, Charles agreed. He offered Rollo the territory from the river to the sea. This was a massive concession. It gave the Vikings control of several major cities and the mouth of the Seine River. But Rollo was a pragmatist. He looked at the map, and he saw a problem. The land Charles was offering had been ruined. It was empty of men and stripped of livestock. The Vikings had done such a good job raiding it that there was nothing left to eat. So Rollo made a stunning demand. He said he couldn't make peace because the land was a desert. He demanded a living allowance to keep his army alive while the farms recovered. He asked for the right to raid Brittany, a neighbouring region that the Franks had never really conquered. King Charles saw an opportunity. By granting Rollo the right to raid Brittany, he was giving away something he didn't really own, and he was pointing the Viking weapon at another enemy. Charles agreed. The deal was struck. Rollo would receive the land as a hereditary estate, an allodus. This means he didn't just hold it as a temporary job, he owned it completely. It belonged to him and his children forever. In exchange, he had to convert to Christianity and marry the king's daughter. In that moment on the riverbank, the Vikings stopped being the Northmen and started becoming the Normands. They were no longer outside the system, they were the guardians of it. The king had turned the poachers into gamekeepers. By giving them the land at the mouth of the river, Charles ensured that no other Viking fleet could sail toward Paris without fighting Rollo first. The deal was done. The land that would become Normandy had been promised, but in the 10th century a political agreement wasn't binding until it was performed. It required a piece of theatre called homage. For the Franks, this was a serious religious ceremony. To become a vassal or a loyal follower, you had to physically lower yourself. You had to kneel, place your hands inside the king's hands, symbolizing that you were now his man. And as the final seal of this contract, the follower was expected to kiss the king's foot. It was meant to be a moment of total humiliation, a public reminder of who was the master and who was the servant. The bishops and Frankish nobles watched expectantly. They wanted to see the pirate Rollo bent double in the mud, pressing his lips to the king's boot. But they had misread their man. Rollo had agreed to the treaty because it gave him land, not because he felt defeated. He was a Viking sea king. In his culture, men were roughly equal. You followed a leader because he was strong, not because he was divinely appointed. You stood tall. You didn't grovel. When the bishops told Rollo he must kiss the king's foot, he looked at them with cold disdain. It wasn't a polite decline. It was a flat refusal. He said he would never kneel before another man, nor would he kiss anyone's foot. The ceremony ground to a halt. The Franks were insulted. The Vikings were gripping their weapons. To save the moment, a compromise was reached. Rollo wouldn't do it himself. He would order one of his warriors to do it for him. Rollo pointed to a giant Viking in his group who likely thought the entire ritual was ridiculous. The warrior stepped forward. What happened next is one of the most famous moments in history. It turned a solemn ceremony into a comedy. The Viking warrior stood in front of King Charles, but he didn't kneel. He refused to bend his back. Instead of lowering his mouth to the king's foot, he reached down, grabbed the king's ankle and yanked it up to his face. The king of the Franks was upended. He toppled backward, crashing into the dust with his legs in the air. In any other context, this would be a declaration of war. It was an assault on the king. But the reaction wasn't outrage. It was a burst of laughter. The Vikings roared. The tension broke. Even the Franks seemed to realise the absurdity of trying to force these wild Northmen into a rigid box of Frankish etiquette. This moment symbolises the new Duchy of Normandy. The Normans were accepting the system, but on their own terms. They would be loyal, but they would not be servants. They had tipped the king over to prove a point. We hold this land by our own strength, not just your charity. King Charles dusted himself off. He was practical. He had his buffer state. Rollo was now legally the Count of Rouen and the protector of the Seine. The treaty gave the Vikings the land, but it didn't give them the right to rule it. To the people of the 10th century, a pagan warlord was a monster. He had no place in the world. If Rollo wanted his new title to stick, if he wanted his children to inherit this land without fighting a war every generation, he had to do something more radical than signing a piece of parchment. He had to change his soul. In 912, Rollo returned to Rouen. This time he didn't come to burn the churches, he came to join them. The archbishop prepared the cathedral. The most powerful duke in the Frankish realm stood as his godfather. The ceremony was political theatre. Rollo stepped into the baptismal font. The water washed away the Viking raider. When he stepped out, he was Robert, the Christian count. He took the name of his godfather, Robert. This wasn't just flattery. It was an adoption. It signalled to everyone that the Viking leader was now part of the Frankish family. But Rollo was still a pragmatist. He understood that the church was the largest landowner and the most powerful political machine. He needed them on his side. Tradition said a newly baptized person should wear white robes for 7 days. Rollo used this week to redraw the map of his new duchy. Each day, while still wearing the white robes, he made a massive donation of land, not to his warriors, but to the church. He gave land to cathedrals in every major city. He even gave away the spectacular island of Mont Saint-Michel. For 7 days he made the church rich. Only on the 8th day, when he took off the white robes, did he begin giving land to his own men. It was a masterstroke. He bought the loyalty of the church before he even paid his own army. He ensured that the bishops were personally invested in his success. This led to a new, efficient legal code. Rollo knew better than anyone how to steal, so he knew exactly how to stop it. He realised that for his land to prosper, the farms had to recover. That meant farmers needed to feel safe. He issued a strict ban against robbery. To prove he meant it, he enforced it with a brutality that shocked the Franks. There is a famous story about a farmer whose wife stole his tools to test the new law. Rollo didn't just shrug. He paid the farmer back for the loss, and then had the thief, and her husband, who knew about it, hanged. It seems cruel, but it sent a message. The chaos is over. The land became so safe that farmers stopped guarding their livestock. The soil began to produce wealth again. Rollo, now Robert, had done the impossible. He had taken an army of pirates and turned them into the aristocracy of a new state. He had married the king's daughter. He had rebuilt the walls and restored the altars. The Northmen were gone. In their place stood the Normans, a hybrid people with the energy of the Vikings and the discipline of the Franks. Rollo lived out his days as the master of this new world. When he died in 932, he left behind something more dangerous than a Viking fleet. He left behind a dynasty. The Siege of Chartres had failed to destroy him. Instead, it had forged him into something stronger. From this fusion of Viking steel and Frankish soil, a new power had risen. A power that would, in the next century, cross the sea to conquer kingdoms. The seeds planted in the mud of the Epte River would soon grow into a storm that would swallow England whole. For Rollo's blood didn't just create a duchy. It built the very throne that the British monarchy sits upon to this day. And with that, our story of Rollo and the Siege of Chartres comes to an end. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this journey, subscribing is a simple way to support the channel and help these stories reach more people. Until our next walk into the past, I hope the rest of your day is calm and peaceful.